Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk, a feature interview series where we dive a little bit deeper into one or two of the major trends impacting the international energy markets. And we're delighted this week to be joined by Grant Hauber, Strategic Energy Finance Advisor, Asia, for the Asia Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. A very opportune time to dig a little bit deeper into the outlook for Asian demand in the second half of this year. So thank you, Grant.
Pleased to be here, Sean.
Let's just kick off right at that point. I mean, we've had the first half of this year, Grant, where Asian demand, Asian consumption of energy was a little bit flat to negative. We haven't really had that China kick in after the sort of surge of COVID, the coming out of COVID. It remains a little bit lackluster compared to the historic comparisons, of course. But what's your outlook for energy demand for the second half of 2024?
Well, what's interesting is you rightly observed this sort of like we could call it lackluster demand, but really what we see is the impact of higher energy efficiency. Industry economic growth is there. That engine of the economy is growing, yet we are, as globally, we're just much better able to get higher output for less energy input. So there's that decoupling of economic growth and energy growth,
which we typically associate with the developed world, the OECD world. Oh, we've achieved that efficiency, but you're saying now Asia is getting down that same pathway.
Well, China has an outsized percentage of this overall picture, and the government is highly focused on energy efficiency metrics. They're applying that to their electric power sector. So now plants that don't meet a certain efficiency standard are slated for shutdown. So it's almost like an energy efficiency competition going on. Plus, with upgraded production lines and facilities, this is all using the latest energy technology. So you're seeing the impacts of that. We look at multinationals investing in Southeast Asian markets. They will be using the latest technology, and they are all very energy cost conscious, let alone the potential for reducing their carbon footprint by having that more efficient.
Well, we've seen, I mean, in this intersection point, coming out of the COVID period, we've heard this peak oil demand for China is starting to come into sight. And even some of the major Chinese energy companies are saying that they don't see it as being too far away. Most notably, Sinopec have identified 2027 as peak oil demand for China. Your thoughts on where that energy efficiency piece comes in, that consumption piece, but yet maintaining that GDP growth at the same token?
Yeah, well, so a lot of this is the impact of electrification. So, as the albatross around the world's neck is this reliance on thermal energy for productivity. And inherently, you're losing 50, 60, sometimes 70% of the useful work through thermal processes. As you get more electrified, that conversion factor goes way up. So you're not going to consume as much energy per unit output if you go to an electrified economy. China's definitely heading that way. And I think by example, they're going to drag the rest of the region with them.
But still consuming a significant amount of coal. I mean, in that energy efficiency, I believe it's up to 70% of Chinese coal, Chinese power is generated from coal.
So that's dropped actually in the last 10 years. It's dropped from 70% down to 61% last year. And that's not because they're importing more LNG or gas for power. It's because of this surge, this unprecedented surge in renewable energy additions in the country. Um, Last year, China added 217 gigawatts of solar and 175 gigawatts of wind in 1 year. Each of those is about the seventh, or if they were a country, they would be like the seventh or eighth ranked grid in the world just for renewables. Uh, so it's what you're seeing is they're doing a coal and renewables transition, and they are not going to be doing the switch from coal to gas like many other people are thinking about or hypothesizing might happen.
So like natural gas as a transition fuel, if you like.
Yeah, that's not a narrative for China. Uh, they are very cost conscious. They can control and manage the cost of coal-based energy far better than natural gas. I mean, okay, so China's a very large producer of natural gas in its own right, but they import the balance of their demand via pipelines from Turkmenistan, from Russia, a little bit from Myanmar, and then they've become one of the world's largest importers of LNG. But that LNG is used for industrial purposes, is not used for electric power. They've kept that at about LNG is in terms of power generation in China has been about 3% for the last 7, 8 years. So it's
So
not growing.
you're saying that not to misinterpret this flattening out of oil demand in China to equate to lesser economic growth. I mean, although obviously the GDP growth has come down to 5% and now looking like it might even drop from there, but ultimately it would be misreading the health of the economy there by judging it on the flattening oil consumption.
Yeah, I mean, because there's a lot going on. I mean, the explosion of EVs, electric vehicles in China, has, that takes a material percentage out of transportation oil consumption. Um, and will continue to do so. Uh, so,
But of
there's a
course, to
lot of the
produce all of those EVs in China takes a lot of hydrocarbons.
right, and that's mostly driven by coal at the moment. That's the challenge. So they use about a third of their coal supply is used for industrial heat and process work. So that's going to continue, but it's going to be a coal and renewables transition rather than a gas and renewables in China. Um, that's very different than, say, some of the other economies in the region, which may be like, for example, Vietnam might be a gas and renewables transition versus China or India, for that matter. China and India are quite similar in that heavy reliance on coal, but massive additions of renewables as their incremental supply growth is coming from the renewable side.
Where do you think the U.S., I mean, the West has been asleep a little bit in this energy transition, this move to electrification, and all of the sort of component parts that make up the renewable supply chain, solar panels, et cetera, battery technology. Can the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and its incredibly generous subsidies and incentives uh, play catch up with China? How do you see those two intersecting, combined, I suppose, with some sanction or with some tariffs and so forth? But where do you see the IRA Act and its ability to catch up with China's sort of first mover advantage on all things renewable and transition technology?
Well, it it's kind of odd to me that there's subsidies and credits being targeted towards sort of manufacturing of certain components. So, like in particular, I mean, solar PV panels are like the sort of the poster child of this fight. Um, when you'll never beat China on cost. Like it's almost you're basically taxing the American power consumer for higher cost PV for solar when you could actually focus on the rest of what it takes to create a solar plant. Solar plants require, the racking systems, the transformers, the inverters, control systems, cabling, all these things. And that stuff adds up to about 3/4 of the cost of a project. And you're trying to focus on the 25% that's in cutthroat competition with China. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. Um, you know, uh, even with
What
the
would be more
inflation,
sensible? What would be, I mean, the American investors or the American technology companies, or even we're seeing some European battery companies moving to the US to avail of this IRA. They can't be stupid to they know that they're up against stiff competition regardless of some of these sort of tax incentives. So there must be something in that equation that seems to make sense. No?
yeah. So it is sort of a short to medium term opportunistic move to take advantage of these credits while they exist, and but it's on a knife edge. If you look at silicon production for PVs. There's a plant in Europe that was set to uh, produce for the domestic market or the regional market there. They had to shut down because they got uh, cost competition with China. Same thing with the plants, the very few plants that are in the U.S. If those credits go away, they will shut down the next day. Uh, there's no fundamental underpinning a way they can fundamentally compete with Chinese scale and cost, uh, and as well as quality. I mean, we can't put. It's not that China's turning out cheap equipment. They're in the solar sector. They are turning out cutting edge technology equipment, and that's what anyone who wants to compete with that has to do the same. And
But when we look at some of the costs in China that may be uh, you know, built into the system into a mid to long term, let's say healthcare costs, other sorts of water demographics. These are, big challenges in the medium to long term for China to maintain this level of performance and success or not. How do you see those bigger sort of longer term trends impacting the ability of others to compete with China as they face some of those bigger challenges?
Well, I think, Sean, you're on to the longer term trend. Eventually, there's got to be a meeting in the middle somewhere. Um, you know, we, China's obviously experienced this great boost in standard of living, and I don't think they're going to stop. And what that means is that all these factors that you just mentioned, societal welfare, environmental welfare, also eventually fiscal sustainability, all come into to meet at some sort of a norming point. Um, Now that could be 10 years from now. So there's a lot that can happen between now and then. Um, the one of the things that actually is kind of forcing a discussion on this is the European carbon border adjustment mechanism that's out there. A lot of economies, China and other economies in Asia, are looking at that very seriously. What does it mean to them on exports to one of the largest markets in the world, Europe? Um, and so what that means to them is that, oh, we have to do carbon accounting. If we do carbon accounting, we have to look at our energy consumption profile and the cost of that. And that is impacting investment decisions at the manufacturing level. So if the United States, for example, followed suit and had a similar, I don't know if it'd be the same parameters, but a similar system, that could actually drive and accelerate change and would be a better way to level the playing field than a tariff war. So,
If we look at I mean, reading all of these tea leaves, if you like, on the great energy transition in China and sort of behind China, Asia, but notably China, given it is the world's biggest oil importer, and from a sort of selfish prism of OPEC plus here in the Middle East,
yeah,
we have relied heavily over the last 30 years on the incremental demand growth in oil from China. And this year, there's forecast, different agencies, different research houses are seeing China 500,000 barrels a day, growth in demand 700. There's a mixed picture, but ultimately, this is a flattening curve, right? This curve is not rising anymore. How should OPEC Plus read the outlook for China when it comes to incremental demand? And they've already got 6 million barrels a day kept off the market. That's OPEC Plus. The outlook for all of that supply versus this massive consuming center that is now sort of flattening off. How to OPEC Plus read that China tea leaves in the future oil demand?
Well, okay. The challenge, flattening demand in China is unlike flattening demand anywhere else because the volume, the multiplier is so huge, right? So that at least for the short to medium term, again, the next 10, 15 years, it's still going to look pretty rosy for her oil consumption. It just because, a 1% growth there is a lot of oil. So, but the trend is clear, across all energy consumption segments, it's flattening out. China's expected to hit peak emissions sometime between now and 2026, which, is a huge indicator of what's happening overall with energy consumption. And I mean, the other thing to keep, the other gamble that's going on, thinking about Gulf exports is the LNG gamble. Qatar, is putting a lot of investment in exports. Saudi Arabia is putting a lot of investment into developing an LNG export market. And I think
As is
we're
the
headed,
US.
and the U.S. is there. And the thing is that it's going to be who can go to the lowest cost will be the last man standing, because again, there's about to be the tsunami of gas put out into the global market. And we question at IEFA, whether or not the demand is there to take it up. The economies that are
Is the credit there, the credit availability for Asian gas importers to build the infrastructure required to avail of all of this LNG? We still see floating regasification units being deployed under lease terms in Pakistan and Bangladesh. There doesn't seem to be the capital there to build a permanent onshore infrastructure to sort of receive all of this gas for this LNG to be the future. Where do you think that goes? And what's the disconnect there from the supplier side that their biggest customer, of course, Japan, Korea has that, but the new big customers do not?
well, what you're seeing is Asian cost sensibility. They are super sensitive. These markets are super sensitive to price. LNG has proven itself to be highly volatile as a commodity in the last, look at the last 5 years. We went from where it was practically free to the all-time highs that, on a per unit energy basis were just, unfathomable to those economies. And that's burned into their psyche, where they're like, okay, that's just demoted LNG to a marginal fuel in our regardless of the price, because they know it. What they've learned the hard way, particularly in Pakistan and Bangladesh, what goes down can also go up, and they don't have, as you were mentioning, Sean, they don't have that credit depth right now to ride that out, and they certainly don't have the portfolio that can be balanced out. But look at what's going on in our traditional LNG markets. Japan and Korea have seen their LNG consumption drop in double-digit percentage points in the last year, And now they are taking cargoes and they're trying to remarket them. And they, they're kind of struggling. And, like the next biggest market would be Vietnam, but they are totally cost sensitive. They're like, how are we going to take a variable cost product indexed to oil, and the oil majors want the oil trading companies want that price to be high. As you said, they took those millions of barrels off the market to keep it there. And how are we going to pass that through to our consumers? Because we don't, in Vietnam, they don't have a pass-through tariff
Can
mechanism.
India emerge as the next China to pick up a lot of this slack and be, a pathway, a pathway to something comparable in scale to China on this sort of, certainly India needs a lot of gas.
Well, the Modi administration has planted a flag saying we want to consume more gas. And
They want to consume more everything, I think he's more or
yeah,
less said.
because there's still that ingrained thinking, more energy equals more growth.
Right.
And I think that's going to play out the hard way for them, because their industries too, their industrialists are adding new capacity in modern formats, and energy efficiency will grow there as well. So you will have, again, that decoupling of GDP to million BTUs consumed. So
The election result there recently, you're likely to slow things down. The big juggernaut that Modi has built will have some brakes on it.
I think you have to. I mean, as a vibrant democracy, perhaps the most vibrant democracy on the planet, they have no choice but to kind of coalition build and therefore moderate their policies. Again, another price sensitive country. Yes, there are all sorts of subsidy schemes and incentives and things that have been put out over years, but ultimately it comes down to who pays the price. And, that's where, if they're going to be the next big gas consumer, then, it has to be at some reasonable cost. They may be the swing consumer for oil. Like that might be it's a certainly their transportation sector is highly oil intensive. So,
Yeah. And they also
if
are a significant exporter of oil products. Grant, we just need to wrap up, and I wanted to get your thoughts finally, coming back to where we started the conversation on China's medium-term growth outlook, GDP outlook. Obviously, long gone are the bionic days of 10% GDP growth. We're now down to 5%, but of course, on a much bigger economy, biggest in the world from a purchasing power parity. But in terms of where does this settle? Where does this sort of GDP headline number settle? Are we on track to sort of your standard OECD 3%? Is that where China's going?
Well, that would be based on how they've developed the economy and based on a high output production economy for export. That would be a disaster. That 3%. They need the amount of inherent subsidization through easy money and government policies that direct industry to do things. It's really based on an export economy, and as we're seeing globally now, many of the industrialized economies are kind of rearing up and saying, hey, we don't want to, we're not going to save your economy by buying all of your exports. And, really what the proof of that stability path for China in the future is going to be, can they stimulate their domestic consumption, to kind of counterbalance this need to export everything. And right now, I mean, they have the new three, which is the EVs, batteries, and renewable energy as the focus of their economy, and which are doing unbelievable work with. But that they're anticipating that the world's going to buy those products. And
the US has just put 100% tariff on the EVs.
and that's the challenge. There are some countries, you know,
If three
smaller
percent
economies that
is
will take
if
it.
3% would be a disaster, i.e., your OECD average, what is 5% a mini disaster? I mean, where do we read this current sort of macro health of the Chinese economy as it does sort of drop five and below in terms of GDP growth?
Well, you know, I hesitate to prognosticate on that because, uh, you know, I think Chinese economic math has proven
Yeah.
itself to be different than any than what I was taught.
Right.
And so I'm never going to second guess their ability
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
pull the
Yeah.
rabbit out of the hat. So
Yeah.
it with that kind of industrial base, with that kind of economic strength and the financial system, and the guidance of the government, you never know what
Well,
will.
let's look at it just finally from the other way around. How big of a problem of a drag is the real estate sector? Some 30% of the was 30% of the economy, the construction industry, and so forth. Clearly, it's ailing. How big of a drag is it on this sort of new China emerging?
Yeah, well, though that bill has not come due yet, and that's the challenge here, because so many people in China put their savings into real estate, and the real estate has decreased in value. Plus, you have the outstandings from construction booms and the supplies that go with that. It it it's it's something that could be a real drag, and I think that's what's giving this impetus to these new green tech industries, is to try to save the economy, and create a new way to kind of bail out this, you know, this debt that's just sitting there.
But it would appear that the Chinese government, if I read it correctly, have been unwilling to do the sort of stimulus that we saw, for example, in the US during the recent I mean, the recent COVID pandemic, but also during the credit crash of 08, 09, when US had its real estate crisis to pump the place full of liquidity and stimulus. And again in 21, 22 with the COVID crisis. But China hasn't been willing to do that. Do you still expect that to come, or they can't do that anymore?
Well, they do it differently. Like the 08, 09, they pumped, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars into the electric power sector. That's when they started the foundation of their national of state grids high voltage transmission network, started from the global financial crisis, um, which has served them actually quite well leading into this renewables transition. So I think they just do it through different industries and different means. It's almost like, well, you got yourself into this, guys, by overspending. You're going to have to get yourself out until there's, you know, and they let that go until it gets to a crisis level. Um, so
And
yeah,
we're not
again,
at a crisis level yet for that scale of intervention.
not yet.
I mean,
I
it
think
seemed we were there a year or so ago with the collapse of Evergrande.
it did, and again, China, in my, you know, to kind of defies this standard Western logic, on where to bail out, when to bail out, what to bail out, and uh, you know, so uh, obviously a great space to watch, as they adjust to these transitions.
Well, we are going to have to bail out of this interview because our 30 minutes are up together. Grant Hauber, thank you so much. Strategic Energy Finance Advisor for the Asia Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Thank you, Grant.
Pleasure being here, Sean. Thank you.